So welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to our dairy plenary panel on the Dairy Farmers Voices project. Note that I think everyone got a notification of a change in the link. We had linked to a PDF that was sort of a prior copy of the report, and so hopefully all of you received the final version. Yeah, we have just a really wonderful panel that's facilitated by Gil Livingston, the former president of the Land Trust. And our panelists include Abby Corse, John Roberts, Ashlyn Bristol, Joanna Lidback, and Jenny McGinn. And Gil is going to give more context and background for the report and kind of how it came to be and its purpose. I'll just say, kind of reading through it, and what I hope comes through in this panel is that getting to a place of mutual respect in the conversation about dairy and the dairy industry in Vermont. I think it's very easy in the sort of public discourse to forget that there are people and perspectives. A dairy farm and a dairy farmer, there's a person there, and also a farm, dairy farm is not just a business, or it's not just an industry, it's a part of a community. And I think some of that perspective has been lost in how we talk about dairy in the state of Vermont. And I think this report hopefully kind of can bring us back to that place of respect and really looking at the humanity behind the issues. And so yeah, that's just what I've kind of taken away from it initially, and we'll definitely get to hear more directly about those perspectives in this panel. So with that, Gil, thanks so much for not only facilitating but really helping to coordinate this panel, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jake. My pleasure. And right, we all owe you and the rest of the staff at the Sustainable Jobs Fund a debt of gratitude for pulling this together. Always hard under Zoom conditions, but thanks a lot. And our crew appreciates the opportunity to talk a bit about this report. So thank you for that opportunity. Yeah, so Gil Livingston, Jake referred to it as the Land Trust. When I say that to my wife, who does work with affordable housing land trusts, she bristles. So anyhow, it's the Vermont Land Trust, among many others. So they will each introduce themselves, but let me just tell you quickly, we have two of the farmers we interviewed with us today. One is Ashlyn Bristol from Rebop Farm in Brattleboro, and the second is Joanna Lidback, who is on the road, but hoping to connect with us. Joanna Lidback is from the farm at Wheeler Mountain up in Barton. I'm also proud to be joined by my three interviewing partners, Abby Corse, who many folks know and saw previously, among other things, a dairy farmer from Whitingham. Jenny McGinn, my pal, mentor from the Center for Whole Communities. And John Roberts, another longtime friend who I think people know is the executive director of the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition. So why do we interview farmers? Why do we spend time interviewing and taking time from 25 farmers from across the state? The brief story is this, that in April of 2019, a citizen group of farmer and non-farmer leaders issued a call to action. Long report, but really kind of 8 specific pleas to Vermonters worried about water quality and worried about the future of dairy. One of those recommendations was simple, I'll just quote it. It was build public support, leadership, and cross-sector coalitions, with which a few of us turned to putting the leaders of Vermont's premier conservation and environmental nonprofits in the same room as emerging leaders from the dairy sector. And Jake, you were one of those people in that room. Several, I think, are joining this conversation. So we had, I think, half a dozen day-long meetings where people developed relationships, rapport, and a level of understanding. But frankly, that process of creating a coalition of dairy farmers and environmental leaders foundered because me, failed to fully contemplate the power dynamic in the room. So to be simplistic about it, environmental organizations brought a lot of capital, they brought a lot of political leverage, and they brought broad, deep grassroots networks. In contrast, the dairy community has lost much political leverage in the State House, has few resources in comparison to the environmental community. And frankly, their livelihoods and in some cases lives are at risk around this conversation at the intersection of the economy and water quality. So we at that point stopped, and frankly, we're forced to stop because COVID stopped all of us in our tracks. But then again, with Ginny's help, the group who's discussing this report today turned to the idea of learning from emerging dairy leaders. Who are those leaders, those emerging leaders, and what do they need to succeed? I won't describe in detail the interview process. Please take a look at the report. I think we spent a couple of pages talking about the methodology. So I won't go there unless questions arise. But let's get started. And I'm gonna turn to Ashlyn right up front. And actually, all five folks are going to take 10 minutes. I'm going to set my iPhone timekeeper here, and you'll hear the 9.5-minute warning. But Ashlyn, if you could please take a minute to briefly introduce yourself, personal farming background, and then if you'd answer two questions, one being, what are your reflections about being interviewed by this crew? And then second, as you reviewed the report, what struck you most? What were the things that jumped out at you as you reviewed the report?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm Ashlyn Bristol. I farm with my husband, Abraham, in Brattleboro, and we operate a diversified livestock farm with a dairy at the center. We've always sold our dairy direct to consumer in the form of raw milk. And so I wouldn't say that that's a unique thing in Vermont, but I do think it's a unique model for a commercial dairy farm in Vermont. We're on 32.5 acres owned and about 20 more acres leased, rented, borrowed, which is quite small for a dairy farm. So we're pretty landlocked in a number of ways. We purchased this land 6 years ago. Before that, I farmed on leased land, on borrowed land, on anything that I could find to throw a cow on. I think I've been farming now for 12 or 13 years, which is kind of hard to believe. And I took notes because I knew I would get a little bit crowd shocked. So excuse me while I look down and make sure I'm not missing things. So I'm not from the area originally. I'm from Southern Appalachia. Both of my parents passed away when I was a minor. So when I came to farming, I came to it with no family support, no family financial support. And I think I've moved to the state with what fit in my car. And I think, as most of you probably know, dairy is and livestock and farming in general is very capital intensive. You need a lot of funds and you need a lot of technical knowledge. And I didn't come to it with any of that. So I think the last decade plus has been a lot of scrambling to get the technical knowledge, scrambling to understand how a business runs, and to do that well. And then I got really lucky in my partner coming to this with a lot more equity, had owned a house in a city. And so we were able to buy land that way. But I sort of describe our farm as like winning a lottery ticket, not through any particular super hard work, even though we have worked very hard, but we just got incredibly lucky and then we worked hard. So sort of a double lightning strike. And then in terms of the interview process, I I've never felt so listened to. We've done a lot of interviews for various reasons with media, for newspaper, radio, or I think we were on a TV show once. Same with support and service providers. And there's always a lens that someone's approaching you with. So often people want to paint you as a martyr, and that's romantic. And so they really want to hear how you've, how early you get up in the morning is always a question that I get, or when's the last time you took a vacation, or that kind of thing. And it's not because they're looking to, frequently, it's not because they're looking to connect with you and say, oh, that's hard. And like, I have those hard things in my life too. It's because they want you to step into this role of, I'm a farmer selling locally, and I want to see that you're working so hard. I want to, there's something in people that really they want that picture of a farmer that's sacrificing so that they can eat, which I don't really understand. But I think this might be the first time I was interviewed where I didn't feel that, where it felt like my interviewers really wanted to know as a whole person how I could be well supported, how as a farmer, like as a woman farmer, how I could be well supported. Like, you know, if we're going to have kids, like how, like all of those things that come with being a whole person, and not just like a farmer who lives to farm and a farmer who's okay scraping by and sort of in a bygone era. That was such a beautiful and moving experience for me. And I kind of had to dig up my experience of it because it happened in June, and I think I've blocked out most of June so that I can farm another year. But I realized I got kind of emotional when I thought about it, because I really don't feel like I've ever, been asked questions in that way, in a way that seemed wholly supportive of me as an entire person, and wasn't asking me to play the role of martyr. That was really quite lovely to me. And then when I read the report, I saw that reflected there as well. And I think that, again, for me, it was sort of a little bit emotional to read through it and to see farmers not vilified, but also sort of not even held to account, just allowed to be three-dimensional, to say that we have needs, that we are sort of bandied about by a larger system that we're in, you know, not vilifying farmers as like rank individualists that all are contributing to some kind of environmental disaster, but saying that, that we need, that we're all being shaped by the pressure of our economies, and that's part of what has created what, you know, the system that we're in right now. But that also we're as a group trying the hardest we can. That the actual numbers say that there is a little bit of vilifying going on in terms of like environmental impact, and how do we see what the actual impact is versus what the perceived impact is, pointing out some of the classism that I think is a piece of the way that both we treat farmers and what we ask of farmers. Let me look at my notes, because that was quite a ramble. But because it was such a good report that I don't really want to miss pointing out all the things that I felt were just the most true representation I've ever seen of the work that I do and the challenges that I experience. So, and the power dynamic piece. You know, I know a lot of farmers that are really engaged in either our local politics, our statewide politics, you know, trying to make their communities and worlds a better place. And the power dynamic of I'm not getting paid, and most of the spaces that I step in where I'm trying to help in some way, either farmers or my community as a whole, that's often not explicitly stated. And so just seeing it in, you know, right there in the report was also a pretty meaningful piece for me. So those were my big takeaways. I bet I'm coming up on 9.5 minutes, am I, Gil?
Oh, you have a few more minutes. I don't know whether there's more you want to reflect on, or, you know, when I recall talking to you, you discussed in depth kind of the elitism and dynamic with folks who are also your customers. Do you mind talking a little bit about that dynamic and how you navigate it?
Yeah, I would be happy to. And are you sort of touching on like a food access piece?
Well, that, but just generally your relationships with folks in a community. I think you expressed that they had opinions about farmers and farming, including yours, yet they remained your customers. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and there's like some interesting cognitive dissonance there. We do have a lot of customers that seem very, well, I would say like the vast majority of our customers come to us because they have like environmental concerns or like animal welfare concerns. And sometimes I'm not sure that they fully, I feel like they feel like we are the lesser evil. But that's not how that's not how I frame what we're doing at all. I think I'm doing very good work for our land, for like resilience, climate resilience in our community. I think that the food I produce is really good. And I think that I treat my animals really well. So that's sort of an interesting piece. And I just, I know this wasn't in the interview, I just had sort of similar discussion with a group of farmers yesterday because we raise veal and it's got a lower carbon impact than just raising beef for beef. It's got all these wonderful things and we're all dairy farmers. And so we're all producing calves and it's a wonderful way to produce more food. And several of them said that they'd gotten death threats over it or had, gotten calls in the middle of the night from current customers, from people who are buying their dairy products without the sense of the larger system of the inputs and outputs that are necessary on our farms, or of like just asking and saying, why do you grow veal instead of beef? Like that door to a conversation that makes things more complicated and gives a better understanding of like why we're making the decisions that we do. Just for whatever reason, it can be really hard for people to walk through without. Yeah, instead, I think it's a little bit easier to be reactionary, to see things in black and white. And that's, I think, a problem with having less farmers, being on less farms, seeing, not seeing friends that are farmers when you're out in public or whatever. Like, there's not an opportunity to interface. And I think that that's kind of a sad thing. Yeah, we also have a group of customers. We're primarily a meat farm. We also sell fruit and veg that are vegetarians but want to come to our farm, want to have all the benefits of a farm that's primarily a grazing farm. And I find it an interesting thing. We can do what we do because people will eat and buy our products. But yeah, I think it boils down to the being framed as the lesser evil in terms of livestock product production, rather than being framed as someone who is really doing good work.
Thank you, Ashley. That's very helpful, thoughtful. Jake, I haven't been looking at the participant list. Is Joanna with us, or I'll just call out to Joanna. Joanna, are you with us?
I'm not seeing her, but she could be under let me just check if there's a phone line.
Well, then we can move along. She did say she was going to be on the road and do the best to dial in. So anyhow, we'll keep an eye out for her. So Abby, can I turn to you at this point? Again, you are now notorious or well known, one or the other, so people likely know you, but as Ashlyn did, a little bit of background would be very helpful. And then, right, so you serve in many different roles in addition to being a dairy farmer. As Jake mentioned at the beginning, you're on the Governor's Climate Council, co-chairing the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And I guess my question for you is, with that hat on, right? So you were doing interviews at the same time as you were trying to do like work for the council. I'm curious what you heard during the course of interviews that had an impact on you in relation to that role on the Climate Council.
Sure. So notorious, eh? First, I'm going to just back up a second because I do want to give a little bit of context as to how I went into this report. I was one of the farmers that was gathered in that initial group, and one of the ones that really yelled about the power dynamic and the issues that I was seeing there. And they were presenting in a lot of other arenas as well. I'm also an environmental commissioner for Act 250, and so these power dynamics are in existence in a lot of places in our systems at the moment, right? This is really roiling at the moment. So that was very alive for me. And a little bit of background about me, just for those of you who don't know me. I farm with my parents. I'm in partnership with my parents down in very southern Vermont. We ship to Organic Valley. We've been a grazing dairy since 1868. And ship milk to Organic Valley. I do not farm with my husband. He owns his own business. He's a contractor, and I have two fairly young children, 11 and 7. And so much of my journey to becoming a farmer is defined by that very reality. And the fact that the family farm model is very dependent in this moment on the nuclear family model that did not exist for me. There is no shuffling that can happen between my husband and I in terms of raising our children. And so this introduced a really new and interesting dynamic into how our farm was developing, into the model that we could pursue, into the ways that I could be present or not present. And I stand to take over. We are a majority female owned dairy operation, which is very rare. And I stand to take over the business after 100 years of it never being owned by one person. And just thinking about what that meant and what was lacking and everything. I mean, currently my 7-year-old is upstairs in remote school. I was told the night before he was going into remote school that he would be in remote school. Just make it work, right? That's where we're at this moment. And so our farm has gone through a very active engagement in what it means to be a family farm in 2021 with a woman at the helm who is a mother as well, and all of the nuances and complications that come with that in an industry that is still primarily male dominated and not designed for the support that a primary parent would need to navigate that. And so that was very alive for me going into this, and nobody had ever asked me what I needed, what would be required for me to be a whole person doing this work. And so I wanted to know, I am so sorry about the phone. I wanted to know from a breadth and depth of farmers across our state what that looked like for them in dairy. Were they struggling? Was I the only one that was feeling this way? Was I the only one that was having these concerns? Was I the only one that was facing these challenges or these hurdles in accessing childcare, not having healthcare, in knowing that the only way that this legacy could perpetuate was because my husband had a solid business? I mean, literally, I am the first generation to require off-farm income for our farm of over 150 years to sustain itself. That's an enormous reality of the moment in which we find ourselves. And so that was what I was carrying into this and what went into sort of shaping out how we were going to try to learn from the farmers about some of those more personal nuances, like Ashlyn said, about what is the three-dimensional reality of the people behind the farms. And so to Gil's original point, I do serve on the Climate Council as the Farm and Forest Sector representative and co-chair of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And what I really took into that from conducting these interviews along the same time was the concept that I'm now just calling farmer viability. We invest in farms, we invest in infrastructure, we invest in conservation. We do not invest in people. And this is cross-sectoral, right? This is not solely in the farm sector, but I'll focus there for the moment. And I do think in dairy, it does present a unique challenge because, like Ashlyn indicated, of the ridiculous amount of capital intensive nature that goes into creating a dairy farm. The other thing that I feel like is relevant in the climate context is I know there's a lot of feelings out there around dairy and its sustainability, and it's in a climate context, what does that mean? That came up some yesterday. And I think I just want to offer that again, in the context, this is where place really does matter, and the context of our soils and our topographies and our distribution, everything matters in that regard. And we do have the ability to produce dairy in this state from these soils, from our topography, in ways that can be climate resilient and adaptive to produce local, nourishing food for our people, which is another component of this that really matters, right? I don't want to put food access or food sovereignty aside either, but and so that was going through my head, these thoughts about, what came up a lot in this group, if I can offer this, is, pesticides, for example, were a big thing that came up. They're a big issue. And for me personally, right, I guess I'll be honest, as an organic farmer, I do struggle with the use of pesticides. They're not necessary for our operation to be viable. They are a component of the fossil fuel industry, but they are legal. They have been perpetuated by industry. So again, like Ashlyn is talking about, there are these macroeconomic high pressure level components to this industry that our farmers didn't invent these things. They didn't go out into the world and say, hey, I think it would be a great idea to spend all of my money on pesticides and fertilizer and commercial seeds from Monsanto or whatever. Like, this was created. This is land grant universities. This is education. This is industry and government and politics pushing on people. And right, farming, I do still believe is a calling, like so many other things that people do. And if you're called to do that work, if the land calls to you in that way, you're going to do whatever it is to try to stay there, to try to continue. And I think too that, and this is where I get choked up, I think too that the understanding of what it means to be the generation holding the loss of that generational work and that stewardship and that sense of place. And I say this, and I need to acknowledge in this moment too that this is not unique to dairy, right? And this is very relevant in the indigenous context of stolen land, of where we are, of how these farms on which we steward, how we came to be there. That's deeply relevant to all of this too, right? And so just trying to hold all of that at once, but find a way within this report to start the process of acknowledging where we are, how we came to be there, and how we can recognize the humanity and the people that are doing this work every day and how to support them to move forward, because in the face of a changing climate, food security, food sovereignty, clean water, healthy soils, healthy, clean air, that's everything. That's all we'll have. And I think we have the framework in Vermont to succeed in this regard. I do believe that we can start the process of a just transition. We can start the hard conversations, and must, right? This is just the beginning of that work as I see it, both in a climate context and in a food system context. And they're they have to be done at the same time. And so I know I've gone kind of all over the place. I'm sure I'm way over my time, but I think none of it is separate for me. And I think if I could bring anything to this, that's what I would like to share here, is that this is all a part of a greater whole, and it all has to be understood, acknowledged, repaired, healed for us to move forward. And I think that that's the work of the moment. And that we need to figure out what it means to bring people in together to understand all of the different stories, because there's not black and white, and it's not even just gray. There are myriad levels, layers, complexities, privileges, access points, inequities, and they need to be grappled with in a really deep and meaningful way, where I pray we can come out of it with a better and deeper comprehension of where we are in this moment and how we can move all of us forward to a better, more just and equitable food system, certainly, and I hope society eventually.
Abby, so I snarkily called you infamous at the beginning, but yeah, I was corrected in the chat by more than one person. You're actually a rock star. So thank you again. And you were, if not the only inspiration, the primary one out of our conversation with environmentalists that got us wanting to refocus on farmers. So John, can I turn to you? And again, if Joanna Lidback is here and can put her hand up, or otherwise let us know. Well, Joanna, turn to you.
I think she's here, Gil.
Oh, yay.
She just unmuted.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, Joanna. So
I'm so sorry. I'm traveling and I was in poor service. So
no, you warned us. You warned us. So I could turn to John if you want another 10 minutes, or go right to you if you're ready.
oh, why don't we go to John and I'll listen for a few minutes here.
Okay. Thank you,
Thank
Joanna. So John, kind of same routine, right? I think people would be interested. I'd be interested in hearing again how you describe yourself personally and as a farmer. But then, having done that, right, you wear many hats, but your day job is as executive director of the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition. I'm curious, in that capacity, as you interviewed folks and digested by helping draft the report, what is it that most struck you in those interviews in relation to your work with the Farmers Alliance?
Goodness, well, it's always hard to follow Abby. But anyway, I would just like to say to everybody that I am deeply grateful to my old friend Gil, and meeting Ginny for the first time, and Susanna, all who had just a huge part in pulling this together, keeping us on track. I don't think I ever got my knuckles wrapped, but anyway, generally getting this going. So for those of you who don't know me, Obviously, I am not a Vermonter by birth. I came from Great Britain quite a long time ago, and I came one summer to work on a farm in Vermont, and to cut a long story short, married the boss's daughter and stayed here. And you too could have all had an accent like this if things had gone slightly differently in 1776. But I hasten to add, it's a good thing they didn't. But anyway, so I farmed with my wife for 40 years in Cornwall, Vermont. We ended up with a herd of 200, roughly 200 pedigree brown Swiss. And I do believe that's a mistake in the report, that I don't see a picture of a brown Swiss on that report anyway. My fault. And we retired from farming in 2012. We had 4 children who did not wish to be farmers. Clearly saw the stresses and strains. 2 of them went into banking and finance, I think, as a direct result of being a farmer or being brought up on a farm. They all really appreciate being brought up on a farm. They may have argued about doing calf chores or milking occasionally, but anyway. I then worked for the state of Vermont for 6.5 years as a water quality specialist, very grand title, which was great fun. I really enjoyed it. I mean, not because I was enforcing the water quality rules of the state of Vermont, but because I met so many great people. So, I mean, farmers, I'm sorry, I'm biased, they're great people. And then 1.5 years ago, I was offered this job as executive director. The Champlain Valley Coalition is based in Middlebury, Vermont. We have about 100 farmer members and about 40 ag business members. And we encompass all of agriculture. Some of our members are some of the biggest farmers in Vermont. We have several big LFO dairies. We have a big, actually, LFO organic beef operation, I think the largest in Vermont. Brian Kemp, who is our president. And we go all the way to a beekeeper, and we have both organic and conventional members. So it it can be very, very interesting. A lot of pressures, a lot of discussion. So what did I get out of this interview? First of all, it's meeting, you know, I'm seeing or meeting Ashlyn for the very first time, not really meeting, but there you are. And it's a real pleasure. And I, you know, Abby and I almost can't avoid each other these days. We meet here, there, climate, on this and other things. But I think it was universal whether you were a large farm or a very small farm. The pressures are different in degree, but they're very similar. They're very similar in that you feel you're not being heard. You're very similar, you're not being understood. Here you are producing these great foods, whether it's carrots, milk, hemp, whatever it is. A lot of our nascent industries like the microbrew, the distillers, they all want to do their production from Vermont grown products. And that requires Vermont farmers. I am eternally optimistic, probably naively optimistic. I think I'm very lucky to be in the state of Vermont because of the uniqueness of our state. And I think that's reflected in talking with these farmers. And I think it was great to have that in-depth conversation. I think, I'm trying to think back, I think all the interviews I did tended to be with the bigger dairy farmers. And, it was interesting. A lot of them feel very vilified because they're big. And strangely, they're all family farms. One of our membership in my organization, and somebody to whom this report was sent, is a large LFO in Bridport. They have milk 1,700 cows or so. Beautiful operation, but it's 20 family members, along with many, many employees. It's significant, and they worry about the same things that the smaller farmers do. Yes, the scale is different. They feel, there's a lot of second guessing by people, consumers, about what farmers do. And it's all about choices. It's all about handling those pressures. I mean, I did not come from a farming family. I was brought up in a fairly large city in Great Britain. God only knows why I wanted to be a farmer, but I'm so happy I was, always will be. But I think if we could get across to the consumer that farmers don't need to be set up on a pedestal, but they need to be understood and respected. And Ashlyn put it very nicely, this disconnect that, oh yeah, just getting milk requires a whole other number of little things. We got frustrated with what had to happen to our bulls, our bull calves. We tried a number of things over the years. We actually raised veal for a short while. And we just didn't have the labor to keep it going. Plus, it was at a time when veal was very much a negative product because of the way back in the 70s and early 80s that it was raised. So it's just sort of getting from this understanding from the farmers about they really do love their land. I've always argued, yes, occasionally you will see animal welfare issues, to put it mildly, but they are incredibly rare, really. There isn't any point in abusing your animals or abusing your land because it won't be productive. And if you get to the point of that happening, you should quit right away. I don't know, Big Gill, I could natter on for a while longer, but maybe you need to redirect me.
John, as usual, you're great. Great thoughts, and a good reflection about why we were able to engage farmers in this interview process. So thank you. Joanna, if you're ready, I'm going to turn to you. And as we did with Ashlyn before you got on, if you wouldn't mind taking a minute or two, kind of introducing yourself both personally as well as farming background. And then if you would, tell us what it was like being interviewed, what your reflections were kind of on the process itself. And then if you'd follow that with whatever thoughts occurred to you, whatever your reflections were about the report when you had the chance to peruse it, what in the report struck you? Jake, do we still have Joanna?
Yeah, she's
Okay,
okay.
can you
She-
hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
now
great,
you're
thanks.
unmuted. Yep.
Okay. So I,
Joanna,
Joanna Lidback, I'm sorry, I can't, my husband and I have
There we go.
Vermont. Are you losing me again? Oh, shoot. So sorry about this.
No, you're good now,
I
Joanna. You're
blame- Okay. So my husband and I have a small dairy farm in Westmore, Vermont. We have about 75 cows at the moment. And that's probably where we're gonna stay. It's my husband's family's farm that we took over after was, you know, kind of discovered that nobody else wanted to. So, but I also have a well on the financial and economic side of mostly the dairy industry, but also the broader agriculture industry as well. So I worked for Farm Credit for almost 20 years and made a big change last year. I started as a loan officer, and then I ultimately ended up a consultant, and consultant primarily helping with financial planning, business planning, transition planning, all sorts of planning, management. What I really found I enjoyed is management coaching and just kind of working through those challenges that we face every day in business. So I came to Vermont to farm with my husband. I had a few cows. I call it a 4-H project that went bad or went good, I guess I should say. And it so happened that he was going to start milking cows after it was discovered that, you know, his cousin, who was kind of always thought to be the one to take over that family farm, actually fell in love with the farmer himself and went to her farm to farm in Massachusetts. So my husband, it was always in the back of his mind that this is something he might want to do, and me being the strong farming proponent that I am, dairy farming proponent, couldn't resist the opportunity. So fast forward 11 years, 12 years total, 13 years that he's been farming, and I joined him a year later, basically, and we got married a year later. Here we are. So the interview, if you can't already guess, I really enjoy talking about, you know, challenges, the future, and what we're up against, and what we have going for us as we are dairy farmers, in particular in Vermont. So the interview process was really quite enjoyable for me. And I could have probably talked all day with Gil and John about the various questions and that sort of thing. In reviewing the report, I mean, I feel like you know, I think it was a great way to summarize maybe some themes and some ideas that we know were out there, and now we've got it. And now of course I'm anxious to think about and consider, okay, what can we do now? Can you still hear me?
yes.
Okay, sorry, I had a call come in and it kind of messed up what I see on my end, but anyway, so now of course that's where I live. I live in the space of, okay, what are some things we can do now? What do we need to be working for you know, towards the future state of the dairy industry? And so that's kind of where I'm at. Does that make sense? Is that what you were looking for, Gil?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so you, I think, among other unique attributes you have, Joanna, you operate at two distinctly different scales, right? You provide financial management advice for large farmer operation in New York State, and then you operate at a 75 head scale. So
Right.
I'm wondering what thoughts you have, if anything jumped out at you in the report in terms of those scales and kind of the influence of those two scales on Vermont dairy farming and the relationships, if any, between them.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I sort of glossed over that, didn't I? So I left Farm Credit a year and a half ago, and I went to join Adirondack Farms out in New York State as their CFO. And yeah, they are significantly sized dairy farm. And we also started sort of a consulting practice where I'm the principal consultant, and I provide CFO type services, basically what I've been doing before with Farm Credit, for a small group of farms, mostly located in Vermont. So I actually, Gail, I've had the opportunity to even, one of my clients I worked with was doing a big expansion. He was going from 28 cows to 40 cows. So that was kind of also another fun exercise, because it's all relative. And I think what you're getting at, what I've seen, what I saw in the report, you know, common challenges that we have as farmers, right? Just in getting them off the field and helping them to make as much milk as they can, to like, you know, environmental challenges. And I think in Vermont, it's much more, you know, with the onset of the required ag practices, it's much more, shall I say, evenly distributed as far as those pressures in keeping up with what you can and can't do and what you shouldn't do with respect to environmental regs. And I think that resources are out there and available if you know who to ask and where to go to find them, or if you're lucky enough to have a really, you know, outgoing district manager like my husband and I are in our area, to kind of help you navigate those pressures. Because we like to sit back and kind of lament that we can't just be farmers anymore, if you will. But then again, I must wonder if it's an opportunity to rise to the occasion to be a farmer. I mean, with all of the regulation that we have to sort of wade through, with the economic pressures, you wear a lot of hats, and the hats just keep coming, it feels like. So I think that large farms tend to have a bigger target on their backs than small farms, as far as drawing attention, whether that's good or bad. And I've found that the large farms, you know, they're there for a reason. They've gotten there on their own volition, and which is not to say, you know, anything against any other style farm. You know, they've taken on a lot. They've managed through a lot, you know, and so whether that target is deserved or not, that's, you know, separate question. But yeah, I mean, it's all a function of balance. I've been talking, you know, the report mentioned heavy debt load as being one of the biggest challenges. Some of that is born out of directly, you know, out of a recent period of prolonged low milk prices, where the bank basically came in and said, well, you know, we can't really afford to let you guys, you know, fail or file bankruptcy. we think we've got enough collateral. We think this is, you know, this milk price thing is short-lived, so we can do this. And so it hasn't been easy. It certainly wasn't an easy choice to let that happen or let that, you know, kind of go through. And I think the same, you know, as far as that balance goes, you know, leverage, if you will, for a small farmer, a young farmer starting out, there's a huge requirement of capital to get started. I mean, even though my husband and I owned our cows ourselves when we started, luckily enough, we still had to rent the facilities, purchase the equipment, you know, and get a loan in that way. And so it's part of the growing business challenge, really, I guess.
That's helpful. If I could, you know, got a couple of minutes here. Joanna, the other thing I recall from our group conversation was you reflecting a little bit on the role of dairy, Vermont dairy, in the New England food system, and especially around food security, the importance of dairy for food security. Do you have thoughts you want to share in that regard?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that we've heard over the past couple years how we have a challenge with too much milk potentially, and I would say we have not enough production or not enough processing facilities. We've let plants get stale. We've let them get out of date. We haven't kept up with infrastructure or investment to keep them up and going. And I think it's so important. And if we come out of, you know, the COVID pandemic, and then now some of these like climate challenges, we look at what's happening up in Canada right now. I think was that Prince Edward Island, where they're having the floods. I mean, things happen, and they seem to be happening more often. And a sound, safe, secure food system, regional food system, is so important. Especially when it comes to dairy. I mean, dairy, I'm a dairy farmer. I'm going to sing dairy praises all the day long. It's such a great, affordable buy of wonderful nutrition, wonderful and readily available nutrition. So, I mean, I think, you know, we just can't let multinational and national companies dictate where the food production is going to happen and then suffer as a result of it. So I think that's, you know, and Vermont dairy is so important to our New England and, you know, broader Northeast food shed. It's what we've got going on here, you know.
Great, I appreciate it, Joanna, and thankful to your brother-in-law for falling in love with a Connecticut farmer and leaving space for you.
Yeah.
Could I turn to Ginny, my friend, Ginny McGinn. Again, for folks that don't know you, if you don't mind a brief personal professional description. And though, you know, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I've observed at something of a distance and close up that the core of what you've done and what the Center for Whole Communities does is to support leaders at the intersection of justice and the environment. And so I'm curious, I don't know that you and I have even talked about this. I'm curious what your reflections are from the interviews and from putting the report together with regard to that intersection, and maybe especially, right, you helped organize and participated in the interview of folks from Migrant Justice. I wonder if you have a special reflections around that discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. Hi, everyone. So I'm a Vermonter as of 12 years ago, so perhaps not a Vermonter by certain standards. But I think maybe what's important to share, and part of what compelled me to show up with Gil with the Dairy Farmer Collaborative, that he was Dairy Farm and Water Collaborative that was brought together, had to do in part with, my roots. And I was born in Illinois and came from a line of Irish immigrants who farmed corn, soybean, and dairy in the Midwest and Wisconsin in the Kickapoo Valley, and then down into the driftless region of Illinois. So I have a background, and when I came to interview for the job with Center for Whole Communities, there was something about, I think, this landscape that reminded me of that driftless region, the sort of hilly edge of Illinois, northeast edge of Illinois, where there's a ton of dairy farms. So, my family lost those farms, and my father was the first person to, go and get an education and not work the farm. So, while there were still extended folks that we knew who had farms, what I grew up seeing was my grandparents and my grandfather in particular, who didn't do well after having to leave the farm. So he struggled in many ways. And I just saw the impact of what it meant to essentially go from having a place that was vast and nourishing to living in a really small house in a not so great part of town. So, that, I think that's in me as I come to this. The other thing that I think is important that you're pointing to, Gil, is I've been doing this work with Center for Whole Communities for just a little over 12 years. And prior to that, did work that was looking at intersection of social and environmental issues. And so often folks with really wonderful creative ideas, solutions for how to address our problems, whether it's climate or other issues, were disconnected from the folks on the ground who would either be able to be the ones to help implement solutions, or actually had information that might influence those ideas. So I have for many years felt like often we're not talking enough to each other, those of us who are actually living something and those of us who are at the policy or decision-making level trying to figure out how to fix things. So, as we began this report process, what I was really excited about was learning and really hearing from farmers. And Ashlyn, I'm feeling a little emotional. I really loved hearing what you had to say, because I think you expressed our intention, which was, how do we understand what it means for people here who are doing dairy farming in Vermont to be whole people and to be seen as that and valued as that. And, when we were in the process of not drafting the report, but planning out the report and interview process and who we would interview, and doing a ton of outreach. And as we crept closer and closer into the dreaded heavy season of haying, and oh no, we're not going to get anyone if we don't get folks soon. So we really had to work hard to land these conversations. And one of the ones that was one of the last ones that we had, and I want to acknowledge my colleague Susanna McCandless, who's on the board, advisory board at Migrant Justice, or Justica Migrante, who helped us bridge to that organization. And it did take many calls, many reassurances of our commitment to ensuring that voices would be shared. And also we recognized there were varying opinions from dairy farmers as to whether those voices were voices that we should be bringing into this report. There certainly is tension in the community around migrant justice and its call for better working conditions, for better housing, for farmers to join the Milk with Dignity campaign. So there's, this pressure that, in addition to being under the economic pressures that have been talked about earlier by the farmers here, there's also this social pressure and this pressure to meet the needs of these workers. And often the farmers in many cases aren't paying themselves, not in all. But so just recognizing the complexity of these issues, I would say something that really stood out for me in that interview, we spoke with a few people from Migrant Justice, and one of the farm workers or farmers shared with us that they had left their home place in Mexico because of all of the oil drilling that was happening there. and that their family had grown watermelons, and it had become impossible to grow the food. The land just became untillable. Maybe not untillable is the right language, but they weren't able to grow in the way that they had been, that the soil had been contaminated. And so they weren't able to support their families. And so that's why they came north to farm up here. And it just struck me, so here we're talking about what does it mean for environmentalists, conservationists, and folks who care about things like soil and water quality to work actively with farmers to create conditions for the health and well-being of all of us, for all of us, and how similar the issues are. It doesn't matter where you go. And so I think that was one of the big takeaways of the conversation with the migrant justice folks. I mean, the other thing I'll just say, we in the review of the report, one of our staff members is Mexican indigenous, and they reviewed the report at the end stages and had a strong reaction to the report as a person of Mexican indigenous descent whose father was deported before they were born. So that the complexity of the ways that I think that CWC tries to hold the whole picture of complexity, that there is no one right path, and that for us to find ways to stay in relationship and hear each other's stories and understand perspectives that we might not be used to hearing, so that our solutions, so that our future can be, so that a future can be possible. Abby, you spoke to this, like if we're going to come through this, if climate, with climate change and all the challenges that we face, if we're going to come through this, my hope is that as we move through this and as we go day in and day out together, that we're really not othering each other, and that we're actually prioritizing staying in relationship and continuing to learn and listen. So yeah, those are a few thoughts, Gil.
Well, that's lovely. I was actually, not to put you on the spot, but reflecting on what went sideways before we engaged you in our conversations with dairy leaders and environmental leaders in the same room. What's your thought now? Do you have thoughts, advice about, the dairy farmers who you got to interview? And are there productive ways in which to broaden outside the dairy community in an effort to create what you just finished describing, kind of common cause around shared challenges?
Yeah. Well, and I'm sort of indoctrinated here in the way that we work. So we really do prioritize story and understand that it is through hearing each other's stories that we actually can become changed. And I believe that, and my hope is that in reading this report and hearing the stories, hearing the perspectives of these farmers, that some of the folks who are fairly strident and judgmental and trying to make change, good people, might see something a little bit differently. And so, I also think that there are structural ways we can address the inequities of what we're demanding and often extracting from communities who are on the front lines of an issue, like the dairy farmers are, trying to figure out how to survive. Is dairy farming viable? How do we ensure that what we're doing is not contributing to the further contamination of the watersheds that we're dependent on? Like, I just feel like there is a way forward if we're more skillful about having those voices at the table, compensating and taking the time to understand what the needs are, so that when we ask folks to participate, whether it's at, in a dairy water collaborative, or it's as part of a climate council, or it's as part of an agency, that $50 per diem is not sufficient. And I think so finding ways to really value and create processes that take into account the daily life of the people that we have information we need. And by we, I'm thinking those of us who are working on the environmental conservation space and are working to try and make change. How do we adapt and meet folks where they are more actively, listen more, and not drop in with the solutions trying to figure out how to implement, but rather show up, listen, and ensure that those voices and those perspectives are informing our ideas.
Thank you, Jenny. And right, you pulled me out of a ditch when we got this started, and I've learned a lot. And I think to the extent that we've been successful in ways that Ashlyn described, it's because of the framework, the approach you brought to us. So thank you for that. And so I'm going to turn this back to Jake. Jake, right, you can cut us off whenever you want. I think we're up for whatever questions. So because you're the host, I think that's easier for you to do, and we can try to figure out who might respond.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. And so yeah, I just appreciate that folks are staying with us, and I want this conversation to go as long as it needs to go, because this is essentially the last item of our agenda. So as you can stay with us, please do. And yeah, we'll open it up for questions. And I just want to say also extremely appreciative of the time that our panelists have provided here, and so many, I've seen really good comments about things that have been said, and Ashlyn, something you said too about kind of this difference of going in with a curiosity about why decisions are being made rather than judging those decisions beforehand. And I think that's a slight shift in sort of how people approach these issues. And I think that's a really important message that I'm kind of thinking about from this. So enough of what I think. I'm really interested in opening up for other people to ask questions of the panelists. And so I'll, yes. So yeah, in this case, raising your hand using the hand raising function will be helpful for me. So Tatiana, go ahead.
Thanks, Jake, and hi, everyone. Great to see you, especially Judy and Gil. Hey, what's up? I really appreciated what Ashlyn and Abby said. Abby, you moved me to tears. Hearing the, dairy farmers in Vermont are such an important part of what it means to be here in Vermont. And just, you two being here, like, especially in your words, just brought me back to like farm to plate and why I'm so glad to be a part of this network as well in this incredible state. My question is something that I've been kind of pondering for a while, and I'm curious what you think about it. So Abby, you mentioned about how dairy farms are so based upon the nuclear family model. And Gil, I've noticed that, the land trust really not capitalizes, but, works within that model as well. The land trust moves farms from a lot of the time from one nuclear family to another nuclear family. And as we kind of try to reconsider what it might mean to have a just and equitable future on the land and accessible farming to especially BIPOC folks, both Indigenous peoples who have been here long before white folks like me, and new immigrants such as our Latinx neighbors who were driven off of their farms by things that we benefit from. I'm wondering whether the land trust and whether farmers think there's a possibility for some way of creating more housing on farms, like conserving farms. Not obviously, I know we don't want those like big McMansion things going up on farms, but is there a way to change how we're doing farm conservation so that these farms can be more accessible to more people to come in at a lower entry in terms of cost, and to share farming in a way that people maybe have smaller pieces of land or shared land? And so I'm just curious to hear people's thoughts on that. Thank you.
And maybe I'll get a start. Tatiana, it's lovely to see you. I don't know that we have talked since we were in Puerto Rico working together, which was a memorable trip. And so an easy excuse for dodging this question for me is I no longer work at the Vermont Land Trust. It's been a few years. Having said that, you've pointed out kind of an albatross, something that the organization and farmers, policymakers have struggled with from the very beginning, which is the existence of housing and the quality of housing can drive farms out of production into state ownership, or they can, as you're describing, be a barrier against access. So really, honestly, hate to offer an incomplete answer. All I can tell you is there are ongoing, continuous conversations about how to create housing opportunities on farm while trying to cap the appreciation or equity component that sits in the house, which has been the cause for farm loss. Well, for the entire, 40 years the Vermont Land Trust existed. And so let me stop there. I don't know if anybody else has comments about that.
I think Joanna is raising her hand to speak to that. So Joanna, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think it's a great question. I just was going to comment with some of my brief experience from a previous life, which is looking to, there are a couple of different ones that come to mind in Massachusetts, which is where I'm originally from. Although I do have ancestors that were born in Vermonters, so I call myself a Vermonter twice removed. But the Hmong community they've been able to set up a program where they sort of have a communal living space, but they're also farming, and it's been supported by groups down there. The other one, there's a few other sort of refugee type groups over in the Boston area, and then there's also I think it's Races Nuestra, which is in Western Mass, it's more of a, I think it's actually for profit, but again, sort of a cooperative group that's come together, originally migrant farmers who have sort of, they've just sort of turned a corner, I guess you could say, and sort of working together. But also there's a sort of housing that goes along with that. But it's been an interesting use of some farms that might have otherwise been turned into something else, which is one of the reasons I failed to mention in my earlier comments. I sit on our Orleans County Natural Resource Conservation District board, and was sort of struck by the idea that, when a farm ceases to exist, the farmer is gone too. And we mean it when we say the farmer is the first environmentalist, because we're the first ones who are there taking care of the land and making sure we're in compliance with it, and trying to do a better job, not just for us, but for our future generations too. I mean, I missed Abby and Ashland's comments, but absolutely the family is the nucleus of the farm. Even larger farms, I would say that's true. Thank you.
Hi, can I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Abby. And then we've got, I think Buster has a question.
I think too, we haven't talked all that much about, what comes next, but I certainly think that this is one of the critical components of the next steps to this work, right? Is how do we examine sort of our institutional assumptions around, well, in this context for farm to plate, the food system, right? So how are we creating access? How are we ensuring creative ways for our BIPOC community to access land and be able to grow culturally relevant foods and access those within those communities and be able to do that from the community up? And I think, how do we empower our migrant communities and our new American communities, our refugee communities, to feel at home here, right? Food is so integral to how we identify as people and how we nourish ourselves on so many different cellular levels, right? And so I think we need to really be thinking about how we could create the conditions for all of Vermont's people to be able to access that ability in our systems. And that's going to mean, I don't think there's a way around it, the careful examination of how our institutions have pursued this. And so there's a lot of things, we are a fully conserved farm through the land trust. We wouldn't be able to be a farm anymore if not for that conservation easement. However, there is work to be done there in terms of, I live in a town that's 2-acre zoning, but if farms used to be communally, tribally, they were villages, right? Like we used to produce food communally, and our system at the moment isn't set up to allow that to happen. I am so sorry. I cannot bring my 7-year-old just screaming in the background. Here we are. I can't bring easily new people here because of the limitations of the conservation easement. Now, I could appeal that and things like that, but I just think that that's a component of the conversations that we have moving forward. How do we become more nimble, more responsive, more placed in our current context, and housing is an enormous component of that. And so how do we position our institutions to be thinking differently about how we're going to resource the ways that the younger generations are interested in producing food, which tend to look slightly different than they did.
Abby, what you're saying reminds me of yesterday. One of our panelists, Megan Brakely, said, you know, if imagination is the thing that's preventing us from finding better ways, well, that seems like actually a low-hanging fruit. Like, we all have an imagination, let's use it. And then also one of our panelists from yesterday, Helen, talked about, but you know, we also need to be really specific about what the issue is, and sort of you know, being able to speak to things in a very specific way. So I think those two things are kind of an interesting dynamic of, we need imagination, and we need to also be kind of very precise in how we identify those issues and work with the institutions to make those changes. So Buster, you have a question? Go ahead.
Sure. It's a little bit of a question. Some people may know about the ongoing work that the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board is working on, a new project, working on farm worker housing. A lot of that started by having discussions. And those discussions, it started actually.
It's a little hard to hear you, Buster, right now. Your connection's
led to the work of the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. I'm sorry. But anyway, the question is, how can we utilize ad hoc group?
Buster, I'm sorry.
All that work and effort and all those people that work.
Sorry to interrupt, Buster, but it sounds like the connection is a little off, but if you're able to type your question in, we could also address it in that way, because it sounds like the audio is a little hard. It's hard to follow.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but basically the question is, how can we keep that ad hoc group working permanently? And the ad hoc group came out of recommendations from the Vermont Affordable Housing Board. Right, and those, we want to keep those going. And thanks for all the work and efforts that you folks have put into these discussions. And we want to thank the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund for all their work. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Buster. Yeah, and definitely an important. Yeah, Gil, were you gonna?
Well, just quickly, and I'm sorry, couldn't hear all of what Buster had to say or his question, but yeah, I had been thinking, and I think he mentioned at the beginning, that the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which is the premier funder of both affordable housing as well as land conservation of all sorts, and especially farmland conservation, has created an ad hoc committee focused on this housing issue. I think the provocation of it was largely around conditions under which migrant labor is housed on Vermont dairy farms. But I think its portfolio is not limited to that. So anyhow, if people are looking for a place to invest some time or effort or ask questions, it might be directed to that ad hoc committee at the Housing Conservation Board.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and Suzanne in the chat kind of capture it well to
And one
say
last point.
how to continue the momentum.
One last chat is just linking the housing organization to agriculture, because that's the missing link, because the housing organizations are experts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Buster. And I think we are at that point where we're testing people's patience to stay with us. We lost Ashlyn; she had to go. So I think this is a good stopping point. And again, just a lot of thanks and gratitude to this panel. I think we're seeing, it really has had an impact. And I think for Gil and Ginny and everyone who's been involved in this project is just thinking about, how do we continue this conversation and this process, and here at Farm to Plate, very much interested in doing that in any way that we can, because Ginny, you said it's sort of like changing the narrative, changing the story that people are telling is in a systems perspective, that's the most impactful thing that you can do. That changes a lot of other things in ways that you can't predict. And so already kind of experiencing that here and now in this brief hour and a half that we had with each other. So I'm excited by that and just interested, in the ways in which we can just keep this going through other means. So with that, thank you all. And we'll make this the thank you all for everyone who's attended the 2 days of the gathering, or just today or just yesterday. Thanks again. It was a wonderful 2 days, so much that we covered and so much more to do. But just a lot of hope and optimism that I'm leaving here with. So appreciate everyone's time and commitment, and have a great weekend. Have a great Thanksgiving with hopefully with family next week, and some time time to recharge and eat some good food. So thanks everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Yeah.
Thanks again for the help yesterday, Jake.
Yeah. Sorry.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Bye for now. Take care.
Yeah.
Everyone.
See ya. Thanks so much.